Alright, and here's the video about our skull. We have 22 bones of the skull, and they're divided into the neurocranium, which are bones that house the brain. These are 8 bones that house and protect the brain. 4 of them are paired. So we've got the occipital bone, which is a single bone. We have the frontal bone, which is a single bone. We have the ethmoid that's kind of right in the middle. This is actually from our colored skull. Remember, this is the small ethmoid bone. Then we've got the sphenoid bone that's in the middle, and that's your butterfly-shaped bone. We have the parietal bone, which is paired, so parietal on each side, one on each side. We've got the temporal bone that is paired. Those are all part of the cranium. We have the parietal bones that are divided by the sagittal suture right down the middle. I'll try to keep this so you guys can see it. So the sagittal suture right down the middle. We have the lambdoid suture, Green Bay Packers in the back. So this is between occipital and parietal. Then we have the coronal suture, which is between the frontal and the parietal. And then we have the squamosal suture that is between the parietal and the temporal bone. Now, if we're looking at the different bones, we started off with the occipital bone. So parts of the occipital bone are the occipital protuberance, the part that sticks out the most in the back or projects out the most in the middle. We have, taking our skull cap off here, we have the foramen magnum, which is our largest opening. That's the opening for the spinal cord. Then we have the hypoglossal canals, one on each side. So the hypoglossal canals are the opening for the 12th cranial nerve on either side of that foramen magnum. We have the occipital condyles. So the occipital condyles on each side of the foramen magnum that articulate with the C1 or the atlas. Then we have the basilar portion, this 4-sided plate anterior to the foramen magnum. Those are all parts of our occipital bone. We have the frontal bone, which is in front, and obviously if I had my skull cap on, this is a large part of the frontal bone is part of the skull cap. But we have the frontal bone. We have the frontal eminence, which is the forehead or the place where it sticks out the most. We have the supraorbital ridge, which goes above the orbit or above the eye. We have the supraorbital notch, one on each side, but the notch in the ridge that can be felt in the eyebrow. Remember in class we felt in our eyebrow area, and we could feel that ridge on ourselves. We have the glabella, so the very top part of the frontal bone, or the part of the frontal bone, which is at the root of the nose or the bridge of the nose, the glabella. Those are all part of the frontal bone. We have the ethmoid bone. And remember, this is our ethmoid bone, the small bone in the very middle. Part of the ethmoid bone is our vertical perpendicular plate. So that is the vertical plate that with the vomer bone make up the nasal septum. So the vomer bone is its own bone, but with the vertical perpendicular plate where they join right in the middle there, they make up the nasal septum. The orbital plate, or the area right here, the medial orbital wall at the base of the eye socket, is also part of the ethmoid bone. If we take it like this way, that right here is the portion right here that is the orbital plate. Remember that also the top fin of the vertical perpendicular plate is right here, and that is called the crista galli. That's the fin on the perpendicular plate that extends into the cranial cavity. This is an attachment for tissues that cover the brain. And remember, I joked about Crystal in the crib. And it's funny because I have a picture of Crystal, me and Crystal right there. So this is Crystal. This is me, my best friend, Crystal in the crib. Crystal standing up because the fin stands up, and then the cribriform plate is right underneath there. So that is a flat area that forms the roof of the nasal cavity. There are holes in this cribriform plate that are for the olfactory nerves. They go directly to the brain. Now, the one thing I was going to show you is this is a real skull. This is the crista galli. So this is the fin that stands up. And take a look at how perforated that cribriform plate is. And I kind of have that square drawn there. It's a little bit bigger than the cribriform plate is, but it gives you the idea that it's just a perforated structure that's flat. And then here is part of the vertical perpendicular plate, and in this particular skull, the vomer is missing, so part of the nasal septum is not formed. Going back to our fake skull, those bones that I just mentioned, or those parts that I just mentioned, the vertical perpendicular plate, the orbital plate, the crista galli, and the cribriform plate, are all part of the ethmoid bone. They're also part of the ethmoid bone with the middle and superior nasal concha. The inferior nasal concha, which is this lower one, is its own bone. Star, star, star. Remember that the inferior nasal concha is its own bone. The middle and the superior are part of the ethmoid bone as well. The vomer bone, right here, is its own bone, but with the vertical perpendicular plate, makes up the nasal septum, and the top fin of the vertical perpendicular plate is the crista galli, which is an attachment in the brain for brain tissues. And crystal, is standing up in the cribriform plate. Now remember I told you that when in doubt, sphenoid. Sphenoid is the central part of the cranium. It articulates with all other bones. And I think of this as a butterfly-shaped bone in the middle right here. The greater wings are down below. The lesser wings are up above here. We do have the optic canals here. We're not going to need to identify those as far as for our purposes, but those are the optic canals. We have the greater and the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. So the lesser wings are up here, greater wings are down here. We have the pterygoid process, which is the whole area when we flip it over, kind of the whole area here. We have the lateral, so the lateral pterygoid plates, and then we have the medial pterygoid plates with the hamulus. On the medial pterygoid plate, we have the hamulus, the pterygoid hamulus. It's a finger-like projection. We can sometimes see that in x-rays. Remember I told you another part of the sphenoid bone that I love is the sella turcica. So it's like a Turkish saddle. The pituitary gland sits right in that sella turcica. Also part of the sphenoid are the superior orbital fissure. See the little fissure underneath the lesser wing. We have the fissure. Then we have the ROS. We have the foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and then the spinosum. Those are openings. The superior orbital fissure will be an opening for the V1 branch of the trigeminal. The rotundum will be an opening for the V2 maxillary branch of the trigeminal. The foramen ovale is going to be an opening for the V3 branch of the trigeminal, which is the largest. Alright, sorry, the video cut out when we were talking about the sphenoid bone, and we had just talked about the superior orbital fissure, the foramen rotundum, the foramen ovale, and the foramen spinosum. We also have the foramen lacerum over here to the side on the sphenoid bone. The last part is the infratemporal crest right here. So it's under the zygomatic area. So if we go from the infratemporal crest, so think of a crest like a wave, so it kind of rises up a little bit. So there's the crest. It divides when we go to the inside and we find the area where it meets on the inside. It divides the greater wing of the sphenoid into two parts. We have the infratemporal crest, and then we have a fossa on this top side right here, which is the temporal fossa. And then on the inside here, we have the infratemporal fossa. So we've got the crest in the middle, the temporal fossa more towards the temporal bone, because remember we're on the sphenoid bone still, so this is towards the temporal bone, and then the infratemporal is right here, the squamous portion of the temporal bone. That is a large fan-shaped area near the anterior. We've got the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This joins up with the zygomatic process, or the temporal process of the maxilla, to make the zygomatic arch. We have the mandibular fossa, which is right here, the mandibular or the glenoid fossa, which is where the condyle from the mandible articulates with the skull, and that's in part of the TMJ. We've also got the tympanic portion. So we've got the external acoustic meatus, which is actually the ear hole, and then this tympanic portion right here is the round curved bone that forms a 3/4 circle around that external acoustic meatus, or the ear hole. We have the petrous portion of the temporal bone, which is this posterior area on the temporal bone. The mastoid process is located at the tip of this petrous portion. We've got the mastoid process at the tip. When we turn it over, on the inside of this mastoid process, we have the mastoid notch, which is part of the temporal bone. The notch on the inside edge of the mastoid process is the mastoid notch. We also have the styloid process, which is this long, slender, bony extension. Now, there is a stylomastoid foramen, and we've kind of got to let the bones or the names talk to us. So stylomastoid, foramen is a hole, so the hole right between there, that is a small opening between the styloid and the mastoid process. We have, looking over here, the jugular foramen. So right here is the jugular foramen, foramen's hole. Here's the jugular, and it's the larger area. It's an opening for the internal jugular vein, which drains all the veins from the head, and several cranial nerves. And then the last part of the temporal bone is the carotid canal. That inferior carotid artery goes through that opening, and it's to the side of the jugular right there. Then we're going to move to the zygomatic. A puzzle-shaped zygomatic, and the zygomatic has the frontal process. So this is part of the anterior orbital wall, reaches towards the frontal bone. Then we've got the temporal process of the zygomatic, that with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone makes up the zygomatic arch. Then we have the maxillary process that dips to the maxilla to form part of the infraorbital rim. Then we've got the infraorbital rim right on the inside right here. Those are, so as we start talking about the zygomatic, we are talking about the viscerocranium. The viscerocranium is the 14 bones that make up the face. So the zygomatic, which is paired, the nasal, which are paired with the internasal suture, so the suture down the middle, those are two paired bones. The inferior nasal concha is its own bone, and that's paired. The lacrimal bones, which are where your lacrimal duct, your tear duct are, those are paired bones. The palatine, right back here, is a paired bone. And then we've got the maxilla, which is paired. We wouldn't think of the maxilla as being a paired bone, but it is. The vomer is a single bone, and then the mandible itself is a single bone. Don't forget, we've got the hyoid listed in here as well as a single bone, which is suspended in the neck area. Now, we talked about the nasal bones, bridge of the nose, the inferior nasal conchas, the lacrimal bones, the parietal bones. This is the horizontal plate of the palatal or the palatine area, the palatine bones. And then we've got the vertical portion. And remember, this is like an upright, a football upright. And if we look at the colored portion right here, here's the horizontal portion, and here is the vertical portion of the palatine bones. We have the greater palatine foramen, which is an opening towards the front of that bone. Then we have the lesser palatine foramen, which is an opening towards the back. The greater palatine is distal to the second molar, kind of right here towards the front, and it numbs the posterior palatal area with the greater palatine nerve. And then here's where the lesser palatine foramen is. That is closer to the soft palate and the oral pharyngeal area. Then we've got the maxilla. We've got our anterior nasal spine, which is part of the maxilla, not the bomber. We have our frontal process of the maxilla, which is reaching towards the frontal bone. We have the palatine processes right here on either side that articulate with the palatine bones to form the hard palate. We have the median palatine suture going right down the middle, the transverse palatine suture going across and dividing the palatal bones back here within the horizontal plate, and they divide the maxillary palatal shelves there. The incisive foramen is where we burn when we've got when we eat something hot. And that's where the nasopalatine nerve comes through. We've got the maxillary tuberosity right here behind the maxillary molar. And then we've got the posterior superior alveolar foramen right here. I'm going to show you that on a real skull because you can actually see the hole that's back here around the corner. So posterior superior alveolar foramen. And then we have the vomer, which is its own bone, listed again. And then we go into the mandible, which is another separate video. Hope this helps.